As twilight descended upon Willow Creek, a peaceful suburb located about 20 miles east of Raleigh, North Carolina, the smooth stone-paved streets glimmered under the soft golden light of the setting sun, casting the shadows of ancient oak trees that sprawled like ink strokes on paper. The cheerful chirping of sparrows blended with the distant hum of lawnmowers, creating a gentle symphony of everyday life. This is a place where anyone could dream of a cozy home, with small white houses and low fences and patches of wild daisies sprouting amidst the neatly trimmed lawns. But for James Carter, a tall black man with broad shoulders and sharp eyes, Willow Creek was not just home. It was a sanctuary where he sought a bit of peace after years of battling in the shadows. James walked slowly along the sidewalk, the worn military boots making a soft thud with each step. Beside him, Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd, trotted steadily, the loose leash in James's hand swaying like a lifeline connecting their two souls. Duke was more than just a pet. He was a comrade, a brother who had stood by James through the toughest days during his time in Delta Force, the elite special operations unit of the U.S. Army. With his sleek black coat accented by patches of reddish-brown, Duke always maintained a vigilant stance, his ears perked up like radar, picking up every little sound from the rustling leaves to the distant hum of cars passing at the corner. Today is a rare day when James gets to stay home. He just returned from a long business trip abroad, working on a private security contract in Iraq, where he trained protection team for oil companies. That job isn't a life-and-death battle. It used to be during his Delta Force days, but it still kept him away from his home for months at a time. Now, with his feet back on the ground in Willow Creek, James just wants to savor the simple things. The scent of freshly cut grass wafting through the air, the warm sunlight shining on his sun-kissed face, and the sound of Duke's footsteps keeping pace beside him. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. "You see this, Duke?" James whispered, his voice warm and low, as if he were speaking to an old friend. "This is all it takes." Duke tilted his head, his deep brown eyes looking up at him as if he understood every word. James smiled, a rare smile that was gentle yet full of meaning. He had faced terrorists in Afghanistan, survived roadside bombings in Syria, but nothing made him feel more alive than moments like this peaceful, simple, beside Duke. But even in that silence, James never truly let his guard down. The habits of a warrior were deeply ingrained in him. He noticed the glances that weren't always obvious, but were always there. A car slowed down as it passed, the driver stealing a quick look at him before hastily looking away. An elderly woman was watering her flowers in the front yard, her hands pausing mid-motion as her eyes tracked him through the low wooden fence. A man walking a golden retriever hurriedly crossed to the other side of the street when he saw James and Duke approaching. James wasn't surprised. He was used to existing as a question mark in the eyes of others, a 6'2" black man, muscular and strong, walking with an unmistakable confidence. In places like Willow Creek, where the majority of the population was white, he always stood out whether he wanted to or not. "Easy there, buddy," James said softly as Duke let out a low growl in his throat. Reacting to the tension, he didn't even realize he was giving off. He gently tugged on the leash, and Duke immediately settled down, his ears drooping slightly as if to say sorry. James bent down and scratched the dog's head. "It's all good, just some curious folks." But deep down, he knew it was more than just curiosity. He had lived long enough to recognize the difference between harmless curiosity and quiet suspicion, the kind of suspicion he had faced since he was just a kid in the poor neighborhoods of South Raleigh. James stood tall, continuing to walk forward. He wouldn't let those stares make him falter. He had bought the house in Willow Creek with his own sweat and blood from his years in Delta Force. From missions he would never talk about, the scars he carried on his body like medals. He had the right to be here, the right to walk this path, the right to live like anyone else. But that right, he knew, wasn't always acknowledged. As he turned onto a smaller path, the sunlight began to fade, giving way to long shadows stretching across the ground. The sound of the lawnmower had stopped, leaving a blanket of silence. James sensed a shift in the atmosphere, not something obvious, but that instinct he had honed through hundreds of campaigns. Duke felt it too. The dog paused, nose lifted, ears perked up, a low growl escaping from his throat. "What is it, Duke?" James asked softly, his voice now lower and sharper. He stopped, his eyes scanning the road ahead. A police patrol car appeared at the corner, its headlights flickering softly in the twilight. It moved slowly, too slowly to be just a routine patrol. James stood still, gripping the leash tightly, not out of fear, but because he knew what was about to happen. The car came to a stop about 20 feet away from him, the engine growling like a silent threat. The door swung open, and two officers stepped out, Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce. Grayson, tall and lean with piercing eyes, emerged from the driver's seat, his hand resting casually near his waist where a handgun lay quietly in its holster. Pierce, shorter but more muscular, rounded the car from the other side, his shiny black shoes thudding heavily against the pavement as he blocked James's path. They didn't say a word for a few seconds, just stared at him, as if weighing something in their minds. James held his position, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady yet unwavering on them. He had faced far more dangerous foes than the gunmen in Baghdad, the suicide bombers in Kabul. But here, on his own American soil, in the town he called home, he sensed a different kind of danger, a danger that didn't require advanced weaponry, just a pretext. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." James spoke up first, his tone steady, polite, but not weak. "Is something wrong?" Grayson smirked, a smile that was anything but friendly. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just passing through. Do you live around here?" James nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, right at the end of this road. 214 Oak Street." Pierce scoffed lightly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Really? I don't remember ever see you around here." James smiled faintly. "I travel a lot for work. I'm in private security. Just got back a few days ago." Grayson tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as if he were sizing things up. "Private security, huh? Sounds pretty important." "That's okay," James replied, keeping his tone light. But he knew they weren't interested in his answer. They weren't here to chat. They were here to find something, a pretext, a reason, anything to turn this peaceful afternoon into something else. Duke growled again, low and alert. James tightened the leash, but his gaze never left Grayson and Pierce. The atmosphere between them began to thicken, like a storm brewing, waiting for the first lightning strike to ignite. The atmosphere on the narrow street in Willow Creek felt thick as Thomas Grayson took another step toward James Carter, the polished leather of his shoes echoing sharply on the sidewalk. Grayson's gaze was sharp, like a hawk watching his prey. But beneath that, James recognized something familiar, the false confidence of those who believe their power is unshakable. Daniel Pierce a few steps away, arms crossed, but his eyes kept darting over Duke, the German shepherd standing like a statue beside James, the only signs of alertness being his perked ears and a low growl rumbling in his throat. James held his position, his shoulders relaxed, gripping the leash just tightly enough for Duke to understand that it wasn't time to act yet. He had faced far more dangerous situations than this on moonless nights in the desert, where the slightest sound could signal death. But here, in the fading light of suburban American town, he sensed a different kind of threat, one that didn't require an AK-47 or a homemade bomb, just a misjudged glance and a pair of handcuffs. "Working a lot, huh?" Grayson echoed James's words, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "So, I guess you're making quite a bit of money from those security gigs. Why do you have to go so far for that?" James shrugged lightly, keeping his voice steady. "I train security teams. I consult for large companies. It's a job that requires a lot of travel." He didn't say anything more. He knew they weren't really interested in his answer. This wasn't a conversation. It was an interrogation, a trap set to see how he would react. Pierce let out a grunt, taking a step forward, his shoes thudding hard against the sidewalk as if to emphasize his presence. "Sounds more like mercenaries than private security," he said, his voice rough, narrow his eyes as he looked James up and down. "Were you ever in the military?" James nodded, without a hint of hesitation. "Yes, Army, retired." He didn't elaborate on Delta Force. It wasn't necessary. People like Grayson and Pierce didn't deserve to know about the years he had bled to protect this country, the missions he never spoke of, even to those closest to him. Grayson smirked, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Army, huh? Guess you've been trained pretty well. Know how to handle some tense situations." He tilted his head, his gaze sliding down to Duke. And this dog, too. Looks like it's been trained well. Duke is really good, James replied, his tone calm but his eyes never leaving Grayson. He knows how to listen. He only protects when it's necessary. Pierce scoffed, his dry laughter echoing in the quiet air. A guard dog, huh? You call this big beast obedient? It looks like it's ready to pounce on someone at any moment. James felt Duke tense up under his hand, the dog's muscles rigid, but he didn't move. He gently tightened the leash, whispering, "Easy now, Duke." His voice was low and soothing, and Duke immediately relaxed a bit, though his deep brown eyes remained fixed on Pierce. James looked up, locking eyes with Pierce. He won't attack anyone unless I tell him to. He's trained to protect, not to cause trouble. Grayson took another step forward, now less than 5 feet away from James. He leaned in slightly, as if trying to get a better look into James's eyes. "So, why do I get the feeling you're causing trouble right now?" His voice dropped, carrying a distinctly threatening tone. "We got a call. Someone reported seeing a suspicious guy around here. Tall, dark-skinned, walking a big dog. Sound a lot like you, don't you think?" James stayed silent for a moment, letting Grayson's words hang in the air. He knew this game all too well. He'd seen it hundreds of times, from when he was just a kid in Raleigh to now, a 38-year-old man with a $300,000 house in Willow Creek. They didn't have any real call at all. This was just an excuse to stop him, to see how he would react, to find a reason to push things further. "I don't think I'm suspicious." James finally spoke up, his voice still calm, but now with a hint of sharpness creeping in. "I'm just walking my dog. I live here. You can check my address if you want." Pierce smirked and stepped up next to Grayson, forming a barrier between James and the path ahead. "Oh, we'll check, don't worry," he said, his right hand resting on his hip, close to the Glock 22 issued to police. "But first, I think we need to see your ID. Just to be sure, you know what I mean." James didn't move right away. He knew he had the right to refuse. He hadn't done anything wrong, and they had no legitimate reason to ask for his papers. But he also knew that didn't matter. He had learned long ago that in situations like this, rights on paper rarely protected him. If he refused, they would twist it into resisting. If he reacted strongly, they would label it as threatening. He had seen too many people fall into that trap, and he wasn't about to become one of them. "All right," James said, his voice steady. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, the movement deliberate and clear, so they wouldn't have any reason to misunderstand. "I'll get my wallet for you." He pulled out an old, warm brown leather wallet, opened it, and took out his ID, holding out toward Grayson. "Here, James Carter. Address, 214 Oak Street." Grayson grabbed the card, glancing at it casually, as if he didn't care about the information on it. 214 Oak Street, he murmured, then handed the card to Pierce. "Have you ever seen anyone there, Dan?" Pierce looked at the card, then up at James, a smirk still playing on his lips. "No, never. Maybe you just moved here. Or maybe you're just lying." James felt a rush of heat run down his spine, but he held it back. "I'm not lying," he replied, his voice a little lower, more resolute. "You can check. My house is less than half a mile away." Grayson tossed the ID card back to James, not holding back at all. The card landed on the sidewalk, and James had to bend down to pick it up. When he stood back up, Grayson had moved even closer, now less than 2 feet away from him. "You know," Grayson said, his voice now as cold as ice, "I really don't like your attitude. You think you're smarter than us." Duke growled louder this time, no longer just a low sound in his throat. The dog took a small step forward, his body tense, ready to protect James. James tightened the leash, pulling Duke closer. "Easy now, Duke," he commanded, his voice sharp yet controlled. He looked directly at Grayson. "I'm not being hostile. I'm just answering your questions." Pierce laughed loudly, his laughter echoing in the quiet space of Willow Creek. "Listen to him, Tom. Very cooperative, huh? But the dog isn't exactly cooperating." He pointed at Duke. "Control him, or I'll do it for you." James felt his heart racing, not out of fear, but because he knew what was about to happen. The air between them was no longer a mere exploration. It had turned into a confrontation, and he knew they were waiting for him to make a mistake, even the tiniest one. He took a deep breath, Try and stay calm. But in his mind, the voice of a Delta Force warrior began to whisper, "They want war. Don't give them that excuse." The late afternoon sun in Willow Creek was nearly extinguished, giving way to thick shadows creeping along the narrow path. A gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the chill of the evening, but the atmosphere between James Carter and Officers Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce was as heated as a furnace on the verge of exploding. James stood still, gripping Duke's leash tightly, his dark brown eyes locked on Grayson without a moment's distraction. He could feel his heart racing, not from fear, but from the adrenaline, the same rush he had relied on during battles in distant lands now surging right on the very road that led him home. Grayson leaned forward, his face now less than a foot away from James, his breath smelling of cheap coffee and arrogance. "Are you listening, buddy?" Grayson said, his voice low and deliberate, as if he were savoring each word. "Your dog needs to be controlled right now, or we'll take care of it for you." He raised his hand, his finger pointing directly at Duke, as if the dog were a threat that needed to be dealt with immediately. Duke reacted immediately. A sharp growl escaped from the dog's throat, its body tense like a string about to snap. James felt Duke's strength through the leash. The dog was not only alert but ready to act. He pulled the leash closer, his voice ringing out quick and firm. "Duke, sit." The command was delivered with the precision of someone who had trained in the military, and Duke instantly obeyed, sitting down beside James, though its eyes remained fixed on Grayson, unwavering. James looked up, staring straight at Grayson. "It's under control," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of cold steel, no longer just the initial politeness. "I told you, it won't attack anyone unless I command it. You don't need to worry about Duke." Pierce stepped up, pushing his way between Grayson and James, his broad shoulders looming as if to dominate the space. "No need to worry," he growled, his right hand now firmly resting on the grip of the Glock at his waist. "You're telling us not to worry about a big dog like that? I see you're threatening us right now." James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew what they were doing. They were pushing him, looking for an excuse, anything to twist the situation into what they wanted. He had seen this script before, not on the battlefield, but on the streets of America, where people like him often became targets just for daring to exist. "I'm not threatening anyone," James replied, his voice steady but now lower, more dangerous. "I'm standing my ground. I've given you my papers. I live here. If you have a problem, just say it." Grayson scoffed, taking a step back but keeping his eyes locked on James. "Oh, we have a problem here," he said, his left hand now resting on his hip, near the handcuff dangling at his side. "I don't like the way you're talking back. Who do you think you are to speak to us like that?" James felt a surge of heat rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He couldn't let them win, not like this. "I'm James Carter," he replied, his voice now as cold as ice. "I live at 214 Oak Street. I'm a veteran, working in private security. I haven't done anything wrong. What do you want from me?" Pierce took a step closer, the tip of his shoe nearly touching the tip of James's shoe. "We want you to turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered, his tone no longer sarcastic, but a stark command. "Just for a check. For our safety, you understand." James stood still, not moving an inch. He knew he had the right to refuse, no warrant, no legal reason, nothing but their vague suspicions. But he also knew what refusing would lead to. He had seen the videos online, heard the stories from friends and family men of color like him, who knew that just one wrong look, one wrong word, was enough to send everything spiraling out of control. "You guys have no reason to do this," James said, his voice now as hard as steel. "I've cooperated. I provided the paperwork. If you want to check, just call the station and confirm my address." Grayson tilted his head, the smile on his face now turning into a wicked smirk. "Are you telling us what to do?" he asked, his voice now sounding like a warning. "I don't like being ordered around, buddy." Duke growled again, this time louder, and James felt the chain tremble in his hand. He bent down, placed a hand on Duke's head, and whispered, "Easy now, Duke. Stay put." He looked up, locking eyes with Grayson. "I'm not giving orders to anyone. I'm just stating the truth. You have no reason to arrest me." Pierce laughed, but it wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the laugh of someone waiting for their moment. "A reason?" he said, his hand now gripping the gun tightly. "You've got a vicious dog, an uncooperative attitude, and we don't feel safe. That's reason enough." James felt the air around him freeze. He knew this moment was one where everything could change in an instant. He had been trained to read situations, to anticipate the enemy's next move, and right now, he knew they were waiting for him to react, waiting for him to give them the excuse they craved. But he couldn't let that happen, not for himself, but for Duke. He couldn't let them hurt Duke. "All right," James said, his voice now slow, almost a whisper. He raised both hands, palms facing outward, a gesture of surrender that he hated to make. "I'll comply, but you don't need to do anything to Duke. He's not a threat." Grayson laughed loudly, his laughter echoing in the quiet of Willow Creek. "All right," he said, now pulling the handcuff from his belt. "Come back, buddy. We'll just do a quick check." James turned slowly, his hands still raised, but inside him, a fire began to smolder. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. Grayson and Pierce had just ignited something they couldn't control. And when that fire erupted, it would consume everything. The darkness had enveloped a small road in Willow Creek, with only the headlights from Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce's patrol car casting faint beams onto the sidewalk. James Carter stood there, hands raised in a surrender position. He never thought he'd have to assume on his own soil. The leash of Duke trembled in his hand, the German shepherd sitting quietly beside him. But James could feel the tension in every muscle of the dog, a restraint he was forcing himself to maintain as well. The sound of handcuffs clinking echoed as Grayson pulled them from his belt, the metal glinting under the car's lights like an unspoken threat. "You can hear me loud and clear," Grayson said, his tone no longer sarcastic, but filled with control. "Turn around, hand behind your back. Don't make this worse for yourself." He stepped closer, his polished leather shoes striking the pavement with a steady rhythm, like the drumbeat announcing a sentence that had already been decided. James took a deep breath, the icy air rushing into his lungs. He knew he had no choice, not because he was afraid, but because he couldn't let them hurt Duke. He had seen too many times what happened when a man of color, like him, stood up against the police. Even when he was in the right, those lessons didn't come from books. They came from scars on the streets of Raleigh, from the stories of friends, from the nights he lay in the barracks at Fort Bragg wondering if the country he had sworn to protect would actually protect him. "All right," James replied, his voice deep and steady, even though inside him a fire was smoldering. He slowly turned around, his hands dropping down and resting behind him, palms open as a sign of submission that he hated to show. "But I'll say it again, you don't need to do anything with Duke. He's not a threat." Pierce laughed loudly, his laughter echoing through the stillness of Willow Creek, like a knife slicing through the existing peace. "Not a threat?" he repeated, stepping closer to James on the right, his hand still resting on the grip of his Glock. "You think we're blind? That dog looked at us like it wanted to tear us apart. I don't like taking chances, buddy." James gritted his teeth, but he didn't turn around. He felt the cold metal as Grayson snapped the handcuff around his left wrist, then his right, tightening it to the point where he could feel the pressure against his skin. "It's trained," James said, his voice now lower, almost a whisper. "It won't do anything unless I tell it to. Just stay calm." Grayson yanked James back, forcing him to face them. "Calm down," he growled, his eyes narrowing. "You think we need you to teach us how to do our job?" He shoved James toward the patrol car, his shoulders slamming hard against the cold metal of the back door. "Just sit tight. We're going to check you out. And if everything's clear, you can go home and have tea with your precious dog." James didn't resist. He stood tall again, his shoulders still aching from the shove, but his gaze remained steady. He looked at Grayson, then at Pierce, and for a moment, he saw what he had always known. They weren't here to test him. They were here to assert their power, to remind him that in Willow Creek or anywhere else, he would never truly be safe, never truly be himself. Duke, still sitting a few feet away, began to growl louder. The growl was no longer a soft warning. It was a clear threat, an instinctive reaction to seeing James treated this way. James turned his head, his voice sharp yet controlled. "Duke, stay there." The dog stopped growling, but his body remained tense, ears perked up, eyes fixed intently on Pierce, who was now getting closer to it. "Look," Pierce said, pulling his hand away from the gun and pointing at Duke. "I told you, this dog is not right, Tom. It's looking at me like it wants to jump down my throat." James felt his heart race, not out of fear for himself, but because he knew what could happen to Duke. "He's not doing anything," he said, his voice now a bit higher, carrying an urgency he couldn't hide. "Just leave him alone. I'm handcuffed. I'm not resisting. What more do you want?" Grayson smirked and stepped up beside Pierce. "Did you hear him, Dan? Very cooperative, huh? But I don't buy it. This dog is a problem, and I don't like things that can cause trouble." He turned to James, his gaze icy. "You control it right now, or we will." James felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine. He knew they were cornering him, wanting him to react, wanting him to lose control, wanting him to give them the excuse they had been searching for all along. But he couldn't let them touch Duke. Not ever. "Duke, lie down," he commanded, his voice now strong, echoing like when he used to lead the Delta Force in life-or-death battles. Duke immediately lay down, his belly pressed against the pavement, but his eyes remained fixed on Pierce, a sharp and loyal gaze that was heartbreaking. Pierce shook his head, his hand resting on the gun. "Not good enough," he said, his voice now tinged with a twisted delight. "I don't feel safe with this creature around. You know what we're allowed to do when we feel threatened, right?" James felt the blood in his veins boiling. "You guys don't need to do this," he said, his voice trembling now not from fear, but from a rising tide of anger. "I've done everything you wanted. Duke isn't a threat. You see him lying down there. Just leave him alone." Grayson tilted his head, the smile on his face now a wicked smirk. "Are you giving us orders?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "I don't like that, buddy." Pierce stepped closer to Duke, his hand now pulling the Glock from its holster, the barrel gleaming under the headlights. "Control your dog right now," he growled, "or I'll do what we should have done from the start." James felt his heart stop. He knew this was a moment when everything could shatter in an instant. "Don't!" he shouted, his voice breaking, no longer restrained but a desperate plea. "Duke hasn't done anything. You don't need to do this." But Pierce didn't stop. He raised the gun, his finger on the trigger, and for a brief moment, James saw what he'd always feared. Senseless cruelty, unchecked power. The gunshot rang out like a knife slicing to the quiet night of Willow Creek, leaving a hollow silence hanging in the air. James Carter felt time come to a standstill, the sound of the blast echoing in his ears, while everything else seemed to blur, as if the world had been sucked into an endless void. He turned his head, his hands cupped behind him, tightening painfully at the wrists, and then he saw Duke, his loyal German shepherd, collapse on the sidewalk, its massive body twitching for a brief moment before going still. "Duke!" James's scream erupted, no longer the controlled voice of a former Delta Force commander, but the anguished cry of a man who had just lost the most precious thing in his life. He lunged forward, his shoulder crashing into the patrol car door, but the handcuffs held him back, forcing him to kneel just a few feet away from Duke. Blood began to seep from the wound on Duke's chest, a dark red stain soaking into his glossy black fur, spreading across the pavement like an unerasable accusation. Daniel Pierce stood there, his Glock still in hand, the barrel still smoking. He smirked, a self-satisfied half-smile on his face, as if he had just finished some mundane task. "I told you so," he said, his voice cold and hollow. "That dog was a threat. You should thank me for taking care of it." Thomas Grayson stepped forward, his hands now free from the handcuffs and resting on a belt. His eyes narrowed as he looked at James kneeling on the ground. "You should have controlled it better," he said, his voice laced with a twisted delight. "Now look at what you've done." James couldn't hear them. Their voices were just meaningless sounds, drowned out by the rush of blood pounding in his ears and Duke's weak, ragged breathing. He looked into the deep brown eyes of the dog, eyes he had seen 1,000 times. From peaceful mornings in the backyard to sleepless nights in the barracks, Duke lying beside him like a friend who would never leave. Now, those eyes were fading, yet still fixed on him, as if Duke was still waiting for one last command, still trying to protect him even though he had no strength left. "Duke, stay with me," James whispered, his voice breaking, hot tears welling up in the corners of his eyes despite his efforts to hold them back. He yanked at the cuffs, trying to break free, but the metal only tightened more, leaving angry red marks on his wrists. "You're so strong, Duke. Don't leave me. Please." He leaned forward, his knees scraping against the pavement, reaching out for Duke, even just a little. But Duke didn't respond. A small, weak whimper escaped from his throat, and then its body trembled one last time before lying completely still. Blood continued to flow, soaking into James's old army boots, staining his hands red as he finally reached out to touch Duke's fur. He placed his hand on its head, his fingers trembling as they brushed over the ears that had now drooped down, and the chilling sensation of death washed over him like a wave. "No, no," James mumbled, his voice now reduced to broken whispers. He bowed his head, his forehead resting against Duke's, tears streaming down onto the dog's damp fur. "You can't leave, Duke. I need you. I need you." But there was no response, no familiar tilt of the head, no gentle lick on his hand, no loyal gaze that he had relied on for the past 6 years. Duke was gone, and James felt a part of himself die along with him. Grayson and Pierce stood watching, completely unmoved. Pierce holstered his gun, shaking his head as if he had just finished a trivial task. "See, Tom," he said, his tone now laced with a hint of sarcasm. "I told you this dog was a problem. Now we can rest easy." Grayson shrugged and stepped closer to James. "Get up," he ordered, his voice now lacking any excitement, replaced only by indifference. "We're done here. You can go home, but don't take the dog with you." He sneered, as if it were a joke he found amusing. James didn't move. He knelt there, arms wrapped around Duke's head, blood soaking through his jacket, clinging to his skin like a permanent reminder of what just happened. He didn't hear Grayson, didn't care about Pierce. All he felt was emptiness, a deep void he had never known, even in the darkest days on the battlefield. "Get up," I said. Grayson snapped, bending down to grab James by the shoulders and yanking him up. James stumbled, his legs trembling under the weight of his own body, but he didn't resist. He stood there, his hands still cupped behind his back, his eyes glued to Duke, as if looking away would make the dog disappear forever. Pierce stepped forward, pulling the handcuff key from his jacket pocket and unlocking James's wrists. "All done," he said, his voice now tinged with a hint of boredom. "You should thank us for not taking you in. Next time, keep better control of your pet." He tossed the handcuff towards Grayson and turned back to the patrol car without looking back. James didn't respond. He rubbed his wrist, where the red marks were still clearly visible, but he didn't feel any pain. The ache in his chest was greater than anything else, a wordless, shapeless hurt, just a void that was consuming him from the inside out. Grayson patted him on the shoulder, a firm slap as if to assert his final authority. "Go home, buddy," he said, then followed Pierce to the car. The patrol car started up, its headlights sweeping over James one last time before disappearing into the darkness, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk. James knelt down again, his hands trembling as he cradled Duke's slowly cooling body. He didn't cry anymore. His tears had run dry, leaving only a heavy silence. He ran his fingers through Duke's fur, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Duke. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." His voice cracked, but no one heard him. No Grayson, no Pierce, not even the curious gazes from the nearby houses. It was just him and Duke, and the harsh reality that his most loyal friend was gone forever. But then, in that silence, something else began to rise within James. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It was a fire, small but smoldering deep in his chest. He watched the direction the patrol car had gone, and in his eyes, for the first time since the gunfire erupted, a cold glimmer appeared. Grayson and Pierce thought they had won, but they didn't realize they had just ignited something they couldn't extinguish. James Carter was not just a man who had lost his dog, he was a Delta Force warrior, and now he had a reason to fight. The night in Willow Creek was now suffocatingly silent, as if the entire town was holding its breath in the wake of the tragedy that had just unfolded on the cobblestone path. The headlights in the patrol car of Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce had vanished into the darkness, leaving James Carter kneeling beside the lifeless body of Duke, the German shepherd who had once been the light in his darkest days. Duke's blood was still warm, soaking through James's jacket, clinging to his hands like an indelible reminder. He cradled Duke's head, his fingers trembling as they brushed the fur that was growing colder, and in that stillness, He felt a part of his soul slip away along with his dog. James was no longer crying. His tears had run dry since he whispered his final apology to Duke, but the pain in his chest hadn't lessened. It had only transformed, shifting from a violent wave into a deep, cold emptiness. He sat there, his knees pressed against the pavement, his hands now free after Pierce had removed the cuffs. But he didn't feel free at all. He was trapped in the moment the gunshots rang out. Trapped in Duke's final gaze. Trapped in a helplessness he hadn't experienced since leaving the battlefield. The night wind blew through, carrying the bone-chilling cold of North Carolina in early March. It rustled through the oak trees, making the dry leaves whisper, but that sound couldn't fill the void left by Duke. James looked up, gazing down the road where Grayson and Pierce had departed, and in his eyes, the smoldering fire he felt earlier began to blaze stronger. It didn't explode right away, no. James was too disciplined to let his emotions sweep him away. But it was there, a silent promise, a vow he would never speak aloud but would etch into every action from that moment on. He bent down once more, gently placing his hand on Duke's chest, where a heart that once beat fiercely had now fallen silent. "I won't let it end like this," he whispered, his voice no longer shattered but carrying a cold determination. "I swear to you, Duke, they will pay." He brushed his fingers over Duke's drooping ears one last time, then stood up, his legs steadier than he expected, as if his body had instinctively shifted into the warrior mode he had honed in Delta Force. James looked down at Duke's body, and a decision formed in his mind. He couldn't leave Duke lying here, on this cold sidewalk, like a discarded object. He bent down, using his strong hands to cradle the dog, lifting him off the ground. Duke was heavier than he remembered, nearly 80 pounds of muscle and loyalty, but James didn't feel the weight. He walked, each step slow yet steady, carrying Duke home to the place where they once shared peaceful moments. The road to 214, Oak Street had never felt so long. Each step James took was like a knife digging deeper into his heart, but he didn't stop. The houses lining the street were now lit up, a few curious eyes peeking through the curtains, but no one came out. No one asked. No one cared. Willow Creek might be a small town, but it was just like anywhere else in America where tragedies like this often go unnoticed, especially when the victim is someone like James. When he finally arrived at the front of his home, a small, white-painted house with a low fence that he had bought with his savings from his years in the military, James set Duke down on the lawn. He opened the garage, took out an old shovel hanging on the wall, and began to dig. He didn't think much. He just acted, each thrust of the shovel sinking into the soft earth, the sound of metal striking dirt ringing out steadily like the heartbeat of a soldier preparing for war. He dug for an hour, sweat soaking his jacket, his breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air, but he didn't stop until the hole was about 3 feet deep. James returned to Duke, lifting the dog one last time and gently placing him in the grave. He stood there, looking down at the friend who had been by his side through everything, from the grueling training days at Fort Bragg to the nights he came home from the battlefield, carrying scars that no one could see. "You deserve better than this," he said, his voice now deep and steady. "I'll make it right for you, Duke. I promise." He filled in the dirt, each shovelful falling like a silent farewell. When he was done, he stood still, looking down at the makeshift grave he had just created. There was no headstone, no flowers, just a patch of bare earth and an indescribable pain. But James knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. He walked into the house, closing the door behind him, and the house had never felt so silent. There were no sounds of Duke's paws tapping on the wooden floor, no rhythmic breathing as he lay by the fireplace, no eager eyes waiting every time James opened the cupboard for food. He stood in the living room, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, allowing the stillness to envelop him. But within that silence, his mind was racing. James sat down in the old armchair, his hands resting on his knees, and began to think. He thought about Grayson and Pierce, about Pierce's smug smile as he pulled the trigger, about Grayson's pat on the back as if they had just accomplished something to be proud of. He thought about his years in Delta Force, where he was trained to face the enemy, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He thought about Duke, the unwavering loyalty of his dog, and how to die just try and protect him. And then he thought about justice. Not the kind of justice he once believed in while wearing a uniform. The kind written in law books, promised by grand speeches. No, this justice was different. It was the kind he would bring about himself, with the very hands that had taken down terrorists in the Middle East, with the very mind that had strategized impossible missions. Grayson and Pierce thought they had won, thought they could walk away without paying the price. They were mistaken. James stood up, walked over to the kitchen cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey that he kept for those sleepless nights. He poured himself a glass, neat, no ice, and held it in his hand. He didn't drink right away. He just stared at the amber liquid, letting it reflect the dim light in the room. "This is for you, Duke," he said, his voice now steady, no longer trembling but carrying a chilling resolve. He raised a glass, took a long sip, feeling the spicy warmth slide down his throat, and set the glass back on the table. He stepped up to the window, gazing out at the pitch-black road of Willow Creek. Somewhere out there, Grayson and Pierce were laughing and joking, thinking they had escaped it all. But James knew the truth. They wouldn't get away. Not ever. He turned back, his eyes as cold as ice, and inside him, the fire had ignited into an unquenchable blaze. This was no longer a story about a man and his dog. This was a story about justice, the kind of justice that James Carter would deliver no matter the cost. The night was late in Willow Creek, but James Carter wasn't asleep. The small house at 214 Oak Street was no longer a refuge. It had become a silent battlefield where he planned for what was about to unfold. The dim light from the table lamp in the living room cast shadows on his face, highlighting his rugged features and the deep brown eyes that now burned with an unquenchable fire. In front of him, on the old oak table, sat a half-empty glass of whiskey and a photograph, the only one he had of Duke, taken on a summer afternoon 2 years ago. Duke sat beside him on the grass in the backyard, head tilted to one side, ears perked up, eyes shining as if he were smiling. James held the photo in his hand, his thumb gently brushing over the frayed edge of the paper, and inside him, pain mingled with determination. He set the photo down, stood up, and walked over to the corner of the room where he kept an old metal box, a small chest from his days in Delta Force, locked tight with combination lock that only he knew. He knelt down, turned the dials to 623, the day he received Duke from a training camp at Fort Bragg, and lifted the lid. Inside were the things he hadn't touched since retiring: a military dagger, a bundle of paracord, and a small notebook filled with tactics he once used to take down enemies in far-off lands. He picked up the notebook, flipped through the yellowed pages, and a faint smile crossed his lips. Grayson and Pierce had no idea who they had just angered, not a regular man, but a machine trained to eliminate people like them. James wasn't in a hurry. He had learned from his years in Delta Force that revenge wasn't a quick strike. It was a plan, a campaign, a meticulously calculated series of steps, so that the enemy would never see the final blow coming. He settled back into his chair, took a sip of whiskey, and let his mind work. He thought about Grayson, tall, slender, sarcastic, always eager to be in control. He thought about Pierce, muscular, aggressive, the one who pulled the trigger without a second thought. They weren't just two bad cops. They were symbols of a system that had turned its back on him. And now, he was going to make them feel the consequences. The first step is to understand the enemy. James stood up, walked over to the closet in the bedroom, and pulled out an old backpack. He stuffed in a black hoodie, a pair of leather gloves, and a small pair of binoculars he used for reconnaissance missions. He knew Grayson and Pierce didn't live in Willow Creek. They were cops in the Raleigh precinct, about 20 miles away. But he also knew they weren't the type to just disappear after a shift. Guys like them always had a place to show off, to revel in the power that their badge brought. And James had a gut feeling about where he would find them. He drove his old Ford F-150 out of the garage, headlights off to avoid attracting the curious eyes of the neighbors. The road from Willow Creek to Raleigh wasn't far, but with each mile that passed, his heart raced faster, not out of worry, but from the cold thrill of a soldier gearing up for battle. He parked a few blocks from downtown Raleigh, under the shade of a large oak tree on a quiet street, and pulled out his binoculars. His destination was O'Malley's, a rundown bar on the outskirts of the city, a place he'd heard the local cops refer to as a hangout after their shifts. James sat in the car, hidden in the shadows, watching. The bar wasn't crowded. Only a few cars were parked outside, mostly pickups and an old Dodge Charger. But then he spotted it. The patrol car of Grayson and Pierce, parked haphazardly in the corner of the lot, as if they didn't care about maintaining their image. James smirked. Their arrogance would be the first weakness he would exploit. He waited, patient as a hunter. Around 11 p.m., the bar door swung open, and Grayson stepped out first, clutching a beer bottle, his walk a bit unsteady. Pierce followed closely, laughing loudly, slapping Grayson on the back as if they had just shared a joke that the whole world needed to hear. James watched through binoculars, noting every detail. Grayson wore a plaid shirt instead of his uniform, but still sported his police badge at his waist, a proud habit. Pierce had shed his jacket, revealing his muscular arms covered in tattoos, and he kept glancing around as if searching for someone to pick a fight with. They didn't head to the car right away. Instead, Grayson leaned against the bar wall, taking a sip of his beer, while Pierce pulled out his phone, scrolling through the screen with a smug grin. James lowered his binoculars, letting his mind analyze the scene. They were too comfortable, way too comfortable. They thought Duke's death was just a minor inconvenience, just another day at the office. They had no idea that right at this moment, a pair of eyes was watching them. A mind was plotting to turn their lives into hell. James started the car, but he didn't turn on the headlights. He drove slowly out of the neighborhood, taking a different route to avoid being spotted, and headed back to Willow Creek. Along the way, he began plotting his next move. He needed to know their habits, where they drank beer, where they parked, the alleys they walked through. He had to turn their arrogance into a trap, and he needed to do it without leaving a trace. This wasn't a random attack. This was a campaign, and James Carter was a commander. When he got home, it was almost dawn. He walked into the living room, set his backpack down on the floor, and sank into the chair. He lifted his whiskey glass, gazing at the picture of Duke once more. "I'll start with Grayson," he whispered, his voice low and cold. "He'll be the first to feel it." He downed the drink, set the glass on the table, and stood up. The dawn was breaking. But for James, the darkness was just beginning. The dawn light was just breaking over the sky of Willow Creek, painting the small rooftops in a soft orange hue. But James Carter didn't notice the beauty. He stood in the garage of the house at 214 Oak Street, his strong hands moving swiftly among the tools and equipment he had prepared since the night before. On an old workbench, he laid out a detailed plan, an expanded map of Raleigh, a pencil marking the location of O'Malley's bar, and a military stopwatch he had once used during reconnaissance missions. Next, it was a black hoodie, leather gloves, and a roll of black tape tools of a soldier, now repurposed for a different kind of battle. James couldn't sleep after returning from Raleigh. He didn't need to. The adrenaline and anger coursing through his veins were enough to keep him wide awake. He had decided that Thomas Grayson would be his first target. Grayson, with his smug smile and self-satisfied pat on the back after Duke was shot, was the one James wanted to see scared first. He knew Grayson wasn't the one pulling the trigger, but it was his indifference and unapologetic complicity that ignited the fire within James. Pierce would have to wait, but Grayson would be the first lesson. He sat down, opened his Delta Force notebook, and began to write. Neat! Sharp letters appeared on the page. Grayson O'Malley's, 11 p.m., drink beer, park in the corner lot. Back alley of the bar, no cameras, no streetlights. He underlined no cameras twice. That was a key point. James wasn't planning to leave any traces behind. No evidence that the police could use to trace him back. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment revenge. This was a calculated, cold, and perfect strike. As the sun climbed high in the sky, James drove back to Raleigh. This time not in a recognizable Ford F-150, but an old Toyota Corolla. He borrowed from a friend in Willow Creek a car that blended into the traffic, its dull silver color hardly drawing attention. He parked about half a mile from O'Malley's, in a quiet alley near an abandoned industrial area, and stepped out wearing a hoodie pulled tight over his head. His leather gloves fit snugly on his hands, and in his jacket pocket, he carried a roll of duct tape along with a short wooden stick he had cut from an oak branch in his backyard, not sharp, not lethal, but enough to send a message. James walked to the bar, keeping a safe distance, and watched in the shadows of a building across the street. Tonight, Grayson showed up right on time at 11:15 p.m. The bar door swung open, and he stepped out with a beer bottle in hand. swaying slightly but still wearing that smug look on his face. Pierce wasn't with him. Maybe he had a shift, or maybe he just didn't feel like drinking tonight. That made James's plan even easier. He waited, allowing Grayson to move freely, letting him think everything was still normal. Grayson walked toward the patrol car parked at the corner of the lot, but instead of getting in right away, he veered into the alley behind the bar, probably to relieve himself or to sneak a smoke without anyone noticing. James smirked. Grayson's arrogance had once again become his weakness. He moved quickly but silently, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the pavement. He slipped into the alley from the other side, hiding behind a large trash can, and watched. Grayson stood there, back turned, whistling a dissonant tune, completely unaware that the darkness was closing in around him. James didn't hesitate. He stepped out his hiding place, each footfall light as a ghost, and just as Grayson turned his head, perhaps hearing a faint sound, James sprang into action. A swift strike from the wooden bat landed squarely on Grayson's left rib, causing him to buckle over with a painful groan. Before Grayson could scream, James wrapped duct tape around his mouth, tightening it so no sound could escape. He pulled Grayson down to the ground, pressing his knee into his back, and whispered in his ear, his voice low and icy, "You don't know who I am, but you will soon enough." Grayson thrashed around, his hands flailing as he tried to fight back, but James was too quick, too strong. He had taken down well-trained terrorists in Iraq. A drunken cop was no match for him. He landed a punch to Grayson's gut, hard enough to make him double over, then dragged him deeper into the alley, where the darkness swallowed up all light. He bound Grayson's hand with paracord from his jacket pocket, tightening the knot he had used to secure prisoners and wore firm and unbreakable. James stood up, looking down at Grayson lying there, his eyes wide with panic, his mouth tightly shut, only able to make meaningless sounds. He tilted his head, observing him like a scientist examining a specimen. "This is for Duke," he said, his voice no longer a whisper but a clear declaration. "But this is just the beginning. You will feel the fear that you've sown in others. I promise you that." Grayson mumbled something through the tape, but James didn't care. He bent down, took the police badge from Grayson's belt, and slipped it into his own pocket of trophy, a reminder. Then he stood up straight, scanning the alley one more time to make sure no one was watching. He would free himself after a few hours, or someone would find him, but by then, James would be miles away. He left the alley, walking with the calmness of someone who has just completed a mission. The Toyota Corolla was waiting for him, and as he drove back to Willow Creek, he felt no regret, only a cold satisfaction. Grayson would wake up with bruises, and a fear he had never known. He would wonder who had done this to him, and he would never guess that it was the man he had once shoved into a patrol car, the one he had mocked as Duke's blood spilled onto the pavement. If your heart also beats of the love James as for Duke, for the fire of justice burning in this darkness, please hit like and subscribe to join us on this journey until the very end. Thank you. When James got home, the sun was fully up. He walked into the living room and placed Grayson's badge on the table next to a picture of Duke. He looked into the dog's eyes in the photo, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "One down, Duke," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's one more to go. I'll make it right for you." He sat down, took a sip of the whiskey left over from a night before, and shifted his focus to the next target, Daniel Pierce. The daylight streamed through the living room window at 214 Oak Street, but for James Carter, time no longer held the same meaning. He sat in an old armchair, his hands resting lightly on the oak table, with Thomas Grayson's police badge quietly lying next to a picture of Duke. Last night, he had made Grayson taste fear for the first time, leaving him in the alley behind O'Malley's with bruises and a silent question. Who did this? But James knew that was just the beginning. Grayson was an accomplice, and Daniel Pierce the one who pulled the trigger. The one who took Duke's life was the true target of the rage burning inside him. James took a sip of whiskey from a glass left over from the night before, the fiery burn sliding down his throat like a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. He stood up, walked over to the Raleigh map spread out on the table, and circled a new location with a pencil. Rusty Anchor, another bar on the outskirts of the city, about 5 miles from O'Malley's. He had overheard a few drunken guys during his last reconnaissance that Pierce liked to go there on nights off somewhere shabbier, dimmer, and most importantly, less noticeable. James smirked. Pierce wouldn't be as easy as Grayson, but that only fueled his determination. He returned to the garage, checking his gear. The black hoodie was freshly washed, free of the sweat from last night. The leather gloves were still ready to go, and the short wooden bat had been replaced with a thin steel rod he found in the scrap pile light, durable, and just enough to hurt without killing. He didn't want to kill Pierce. Not now. Death was too easy. He wanted Pierce to feel the pain, the helplessness, just like he felt kneeling beside Duke on the sidewalk of Willow Creek. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James drove his old Toyota Corolla out of Willow Creek, this time parking in an empty lot about half a mile from the Rusty Anchor. He stepped out, pulling his hoodie over his head, and made his way through the narrow alleys of Raleigh, steering clear of the streetlights. The Rusty Anchor loomed ahead, a low building with weathered brick walls and a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." Half of the letters burned out. Outside, a few motorcycles and an old Chevy Impala were haphazardly parked. But James quickly spotted Pierce's Dodge Charger tucked away in the far corner of the lot, a clear sign that his enemy was inside. He hid behind a pile of wooden crates near the entrance, peering through a crack. The bar door swung open a few times, spilling out the sounds of drunken laughter and the smell of cheap beer, but Pierce hadn't shown up yet. James waited, patient as a hunter, letting time slip by until his watch ticked to 11:45 p.m. Finally, Pierce stepped out, his heavy gait and muscular shoulders tense beneath a leather jacket, one hand clutching a beer bottle, the other fiddling with a set of car keys. He wasn't alone, a big guy, probably a drinking buddy, trailed behind him, but James wasn't worried. He would break away soon, and that would be his moment to strike. Pierce patted the guy on the shoulder, said something, and then burst out laughing before turning into an alley next to the bar, a shortcut leading to the parking lot. James moved quickly, circling around to cut him off. The alley was pitch black, with only a faint light from a distant street lamp, and not a soul in sight, perfect for his plan. He stood waiting, his back pressed against the brick wall, a thin steel bar gripped tightly in his hand, his breathing steady like when he used to ambush enemies in Afghanistan. Pierce stepped into the alley, whistling a catchy tune, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby. When he was about 10 feet away from James sprang out like a ghost, silent as a shadow. The steel rod swung up, striking Pierce right in the left knee, causing him to buckle down with a painful groan. Before Pierce could react, James landed a punch to his gut, hard enough that a beer bottle fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. Pierce collapsed, clutching his stomach, mouth agape as he tried to scream, but James had already wrapped duct tape around his mouth, tightening it just like he had done to Grayson the night before. "Don't move," James whispered, his voice low and menacing, his cold eyes fixed on Pierce, who was thrashing beneath him. He pressed his knee into Pierce's chest, pinning him down, and leaned in close to his face. "Do you remember me?" Pierce's eyes widened in panic mixed with recognition, but James didn't give him a moment to respond. He landed another punch to Pierce's jaw, hearing the bones crack, and blood began to seep from the corner of his mouth through the tape. James pulled Pierce deeper into the alley, where darkness swallowed all light. He bound his hands with paracord, tightening the knot, and stood up, looking down at the man who had shot Duke without a hint of remorse. "This is for Duke," he said, his voice no longer a whisper but a clear accusation. "You pulled the trigger, Pierce. You took away the most important thing in my life, and now you're going to pay." Pierce struggled against the tape, his eyes filled with fear and anger, but James didn't care. He pulled the police badge from Pierce's belt just like he had with Grayson and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he kicked Pierce in the ribs, hard enough to make him curl up, groaning in pain. "This is just beginning," James said, his voice as cold as ice. "You'll never forget me, Pierce. I'm going to make you live in fear every single day." James stood tall, checking the alley one last time to make sure no one was watching, no one was listening. Pierce would either find a way out on his own, or someone would discover him. But by then, James would be long gone. He left the alley, walking with the calmness of someone who had just completed another mission. He returned to his Toyota Corolla and drove back to Willow Creek, his mind sharper than ever. Pierce had felt his anger, But James knew that wasn't enough. Beating him was just the first step. He wanted them to lose everything. When he got home, the sky was just about to brighten. He walked into the living room, placing Pierce's badge next to Grayson's on the table, right beside the picture of Duke. He sat down, gazing into the dog's eyes in the photo, and a faint smile flickered across his lips. "Both of you have finished the first part, Duke," he said, his voice deep and resolute. "But I'm not stopping here. They'll have to face much more than this." He took one last sip of whiskey, set the glass down, and closed his eyes, letting his mind rest, but only for a moment. The real battle was still waiting ahead. The morning light blazed across the sky in Willow Creek, casting a golden hue over the small rooftops of the peaceful town. But inside the house at 214 Oak Street, James Carter felt anything but peaceful. He stood in front of the oak table in the living room, his deep brown eyes fixed on two police badges, one belonging to Thomas Grayson and the other to Daniel Pierce, sitting next to a photo of Duke like silent trophies. Last night, he had made Pierce feel pain, leaving him in the alley behind Rusty Anchor with bruises and a fear that James knew would never fade. But as he sank into the old armchair and took a swig of whiskey from a nearly empty Jack Daniels bottle, he realized that beating him was just the beginning. This was merely the first step of warning. The real battle was still ahead. James set his glass down, stood up, and walked over to the Raleigh map on the table. He picked up a pencil and crossed out the two locations, O'Malley's and Rusty Anchor, like a soldier marking off completed targets. Grayson and Pierce could now feel his power, but James didn't want to stop at just physical pain. He wanted them to lose everything: their jobs, their reputations, their freedom, just like they had stolen Duke from him. He had taken them down in the shadows, but to completely destroy them, he needed to light the light of truth, of justice that he would bring himself. He returned to the garage, opened the metal chest from the Delta Force days, and pulled out a small device he never thought he'd use again on American soil. A mini camera, the kind he used to record ambushes in the field. It was compact, wireless, easy to hide, and capable of filming in the dark with crystal clear quality. James checked the battery, ensuring it was still operational, and a faint smile flickered across his lips. Grayson and Pierce thought they had escaped him when they left Willow Creek that night, but they didn't know that James Carter never gave up, not in Iraq, not in Afghanistan, and certainly not here. He spent the whole day planning, sitting in the garage with a map and a notebook, jotting down every detail. He knew Grayson and Pierce would be more cautious. After what he had done, they would be suspicious, looking for ways to retaliate, and that was exactly what he wanted. He wanted them to make mistakes, to reveal their true selves, and he would be there to capture it all. He wrote, "Next step, lure them to the house. Set the trap. Film it. Let them dig their own graves." He underlined the words, "film it." That was his new weapon, sharper than any steel or punch. As night fell, James made his final preparations. He slipped on a black hoodie, put on leather gloves, and tucked a mini camera into his pocket. He wasn't driving this time. It was too easy to get spotted. Instead, he walked out of Willow Creek, cutting through back roads and fields to reach a bus station 10 miles from Raleigh. He boarded the bus, settling into a hidden corner, pulling his hood tightly over his head, and focused his mind on the goal: to make Grayson and Pierce confront him once again, but this time on his home turf. That night, James didn't look for Grayson or Pierce at the bars. He knew they wouldn't show up after what he had done. Instead, he went home and set a trap right in his own house. He placed a whiskey bottle on the living room table, uncapped it as if he had just finished drinking, stacked some old letters on the kitchen counter to create a sense of chaos, and most importantly, left the garage door slightly ajar, a silent invitation. He knew Grayson and Pierce wouldn't be able to resist. He installed mini cameras in 3 locations, one in the living room, hidden behind a bookshelf, one in the garage, mounted on a tool shelf, and one in the backyard, concealed in the bushes near the fence. Every angle was carefully calculated to ensure he wouldn't miss a single action. James waited. He knew they wouldn't come today, probably not tomorrow, but they would come. Their pride, their anger from the blows he had dealt them, would draw them to Willow Creek, right to his doorstep. And when they arrived, he would be ready. 3 days later, the opportunity arrived. James sat in the living room, the dim light casting shadows, pretending to read an old book when the headlights of a car swept past the window. He heard the engine rumble, followed by the sound of the car door slamming shut not gently, but forcefully, like someone filled with anger. He set the book down, stood up, and peered through the curtain. Grayson and Pierce were standing right at his front door, their faces tense, hands clenched as if ready for a fight. Grayson knocked on the door, hard enough to make it tremble, while Pierce stood behind him, hand resting on his hip, close to his Glock. James took a deep breath, letting them knock a few more times before opening the door. He stood there, shoulders relaxed, his gaze calm yet sharp as a knife. "Is something wrong, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice steady, as if he had no idea about the bruises on their bodies. Grayson stepped forward, shoving his chest against James, forcing him to back up into the house. "You think you're so smart, huh?" he growled, his eyes narrowing with rage. "You think you can take me and Pierce on and just walk away?" James stepped back, not resisting, allowing Grayson and Pierce to enter the house. He heard the sound of the camera starting to record a faint noise that only he could recognize. "I don't know what you guys are talking about," he replied, his voice steady, but inside he smiled. They had walked right into his trap. Pierce slammed the door shut behind him and stepped closer to James, his hands clenched into fists. "Don't pretend with me," he growled, his voice rough from the lingering pain. "You're the one who did this, aren't you? Who do you think you are, messing with us?" James didn't respond right away. He let them move closer, allowing him to think they were in control. Grayson shoved him harder, sending him crashing into the coffee table, the whiskey bottle shattering on the floor. "You're going to regret messing with us," Grayson said, then landed a punch to James's gut. He doubled over, gasping for air, but didn't fight back. He wanted them to go further, wanted the camera to capture every moment. Pierce rushed in and landed a punch on James's jaw, causing his head to tilt to the side. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but he still didn't fight back. He fell to the floor, looking up at them, and finally spoke, his voice low and chilling. "You just sealed your own fate." Grayson laughed loudly, but in his eyes, James saw a glimmer of doubt. Pierce kicked him in the side, hard enough that he coughed up blood, but James only smiled a chilling, terrifying smile. "Go on," he whispered, "before things get worse." Grayson and Pierce looked at each other, then turned to leave the house, leaving James lying on the floor. As the sound of their car faded away, James got up, wiped the blood from his mouth, and walked over to the bookshelf. He took out the camera, checked the footage, everything was perfect. He sat down, stared at the screen, and whispered to the picture of Duke. "I've got them. Duke. Now they're going to lose it all." The night in Willow Creek was as quiet as ever, but inside the small house at 214 Oak Street, the air was thick with the smell of blood and whiskey. James Carter sat on the living room floor, his back against the oak coffee table, blood still trickling from a corner of his mouth after Daniel Pierce's punch. The Jack Daniels bottle lay shattered on the floor, shards of glass glinting under the dim light. But James didn't care. He wiped the blood with the back of his hand, slowly stood up, and walked over to the bookshelf where the mini-cam was hidden away. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling not from pain, but from the cold thrill surging inside him. He pressed play, and the small screen lit up with a clear image. Grayson and Pierce storming into his house, pushing him down, punching him, kicking him, every action captured, not missing a single detail. James smiled a smile that held no joy, but rather the satisfaction of a warrior who had just planted a mine beneath his enemy's feet. He transferred the footage to his laptop, checking it from different angles. The camera in the garage showed them walking through the slightly open door, while the backyard camera captured the moment they left, their faces wearing smug expressions. Everything was perfect, not just evidence, but a weapon sharper than any punch he had ever thrown at them in the dark alleys of Raleigh. He sat down in the armchair, laptop on his lap, and began editing the footage. With the skills he had learned in Delta Force for analyzing reconnaissance videos, he cut together the most crucial moments. Grayson's shove, Pierce's punch, their mocking laughter as they walked away. He didn't add any fake sound effects or over-edit the footage. The truth was powerful enough on its own. When he was finished, he saved the file to a small USB drive, then tucked it away in a metal chest in the garage, locking it with the code 623 the day he got Duke, the day that had now become the driving force behind all his actions. James stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the dark road of Willow Creek. He knew Grayson and Pierce wouldn't stop. They were too arrogant, too confident that their badge would protect them from any consequences. But this time they were wrong. They had come into his home, attacked him on his own turf, and now he had the evidence to turn that arrogance into a noose around their necks. He turned back to the table, holding Duke's photo in his hands, and whispered, "I've got them, Duke. They think they're stronger than me, but they don't know who I am." He set the photo down, then walked into the bedroom, pulling out a burner phone that couldn't be traced, one he had used during covert missions. He typed a short message, "Check your email tomorrow morning. There's something you need to see." He sent it to an old acquaintance from his military days, now an investigative reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer, someone James knew wouldn't miss the chance to expose the corruption within the police force. As the sun rose, James couldn't sleep. He sat in the garage, opened the metal trunk once more, and pulled out another stack of documents he had quietly gathered over the past few days. The complaint records against Grayson and Pierce that he had dug up from a source in the Raleigh Police Department. A former friend from Fort Bragg owed him a favor. There were at least 12 complaints over the last 5 years, ranging from excessive force to unlawful arrests, but all had been buried under layers of dust in the system. James scanned each document with a small scanner, saving them to the same USB drive as the footage. This was no longer just Duke's story. This was the story of everyone Grayson and Pierce had hurt, those who didn't have the power to fight back. He drove to a small post office on the outskirts of Raleigh, about 15 miles from Willow Creek, and sent a USB drive anonymously to the Raleigh News and Observer. He wore a mask and a baseball cap, leaving no fingerprints. Everything was calculated like a military operation. When he returned to his car, he felt a rare sense of relief, not because everything was over, but because he knew the seeds of collapse had been sown. The next day, James sat in the living room, turning on the TV to the local news channel. It didn't take long for the story to explode. An emergency bulletin flashed across the screen. Raleigh police accused of misconduct. Shocking footage just sent to newsroom. The anchor, a woman with a serious tone, read aloud. An anonymous video shows 2 police officers, identified as Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, assaulting a man in his own home in Willow Creek. Sources say this is not the first time they have faced allegations of misconduct. James turned off the TV, stood up, and walked over to the table. He looked at the 2 badges of Grayson and Pierce, now not just trophies but symbols of their impending downfall. He knew the footage would spread quickly, not just on TV, but on social media, in community groups, reaching those who had once been their victims. He understood that Grayson and Pierce would panic, would try to find ways to deny it, but they couldn't escape the light he had shone on them. He picked up the burner phone again, sending another message to the reporter. "Check the files on the USB. There's more to it." Then he turned off the phone, removed the battery, and smashed it with a hammer in the garage, leaving no trace, just like he had been trained. He returned to the living room, sat down, and took one last sip of whiskey from a nearly empty bottle. "They're falling, Duke," he whispered to the picture of the dog. "But I'm not done yet. They're going to lose everything." James stood up and walked out to the backyard, where he had buried Duke. He knelt down, placing his hand on the cold earth, letting the silence envelop him. He knew this fight wasn't just about him or Duke. It was about justice, about those who never had a chance to stand up against Grayson and Pierce. And now, with the footage and records in the hands of press, he had opened the door for the world to see who they really were. But he also knew that to completely destroy them, he needed one final blow of strike. He would deliver when the time was right. The daylight flooded to the windows of the house at 214 Oak Street, but James Carter no longer noticed the little details like the sunlight or the birds chirping outside. He sat in the armchair in the living room, his deep brown eyes glued to the TV screen, where the local news in Raleigh was still buzzing with the story he had ignited. The anchor, with a sharp voice and wide, excited eyes, read aloud. Shocking footage of Raleigh police officers Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce attacking a man in his own home at Willow Creek has gone viral on social media, racking up thousands of shares within just a few hours. Sources say this is just the tip of the iceberg, as complaints against him have also been sent to the press, exposing a series of misconduct over the years. James turned off the TV, set the remote down on the table, and stood up. He walked over to a window, gazing out at the quiet street of Willow Creek, where neighbors were starting to gather in their front yards, whispering to each other about the unfolding story. He heard his name, James Carter, slip from the lips of an elderly woman standing near the fence, her voice filled with curiosity and sympathy. He knew they didn't recognize him as the man in the footage, didn't realize he was the one behind it all. To them, he was just a quiet guy living at the end of the street. But to Grayson and Pierce, he was now the nightmare they couldn't escape. He turned back to the oak table, where the two badges of Grayson and Pierce lay next to a photo of Duke, like symbols of victory. He picked up the picture, his fingers gently brushing over the deep brown eyes of the dog, and whispered, "They're panicking, Duke. They don't know what to do anymore." He set the photo down and walked into the garage, opening his laptop to check emails from an anonymous account he had created. A message from a reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer popped up. The records matched the footage. "We're digging deeper. This is a blockbuster. Thanks to my source. Someone is doing good work." James gave a faint smile. He didn't need thanks. He just needed results. The storm he unleashed is now spreading beyond anyone's expectations. He opens an incognito tab on his laptop and scrolls through Twitter with a hashtag Justice for Willow Creek is trending with thousands of posts. One person writes, "These two cops beat me up 2 years ago and no one believed me. Now everyone can see the truth." Another post, "Grayson and Pierce are a disgrace to Raleigh. They need to go to jail." James reads each line, feeling the power of the truth he has unleashed, not just for Duke, but for all those who have been trampled by those two. He knew Grayson and Pierce were feeling the pressure. They wouldn't just sit back. They would try to fight back, looking for ways to deny it all, but every step they took only dug them deeper. James had anticipated this. He stood up and walked out to the backyard, where Duke's grave lay quietly in the sunlight. He knelt down, placed his hand on the soil, and said, "I promise you, Duke, they won't get away with this. Not ever." The wind blew through, carrying the scent of fresh grass, and in that moment, James felt a rare sense of peace, not because everything was over, but because he knew he was on the right path. 20 miles away in Raleigh Police Station, the atmosphere was as tense as a drawn bowstring. Thomas Grayson sat in the break room, gripping a cold cup of coffee, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He gazed out the window, watching a throng of reporters gather outside, cameras and microphones raised high, like blades ready to slice him apart. Daniel Pierce stood in the corner of the room, pounding his fist against the wall, leaving a small crack in the paint. "Damn it!" Pierce roared, his voice hoarse. "It's that bastard, I knew it. Carter, I told you we should have dealt with him right from the start." Grayson turned back, his eyes narrowed with a mix of anger and fear. "You think I don't know," he growled. "But what now? That footage is everywhere, Dan. We can't deny we broke into his house and beat him up. How do you plan to explain this to the boss?" Pierce stepped forward, grabbing Grayson by the collar and yanking him up from the chair. "I don't care about the boss," he shouted. "I want to find that guy and snap his neck. What he did to us, Tom. He turned us into a joke." Grayson pushed Pierce away, breathing heavily. "Use your head," he said, his voice lower but still trembling. "If we go after him now, things will get worse. We need to find a way to bury to say the footage was edited, that he attacked us first." Pierce scoffed, but his laughter lacked confidence it once had. "Who do you think is going to believe us? Those guys online are digging up everything, old cases, complaints. We're done for if we don't do something." Grayson didn't respond. He sat down, cradling his head in his hands, and for the first time in his life, he felt small, not the proud cop with a gun and a badge, but a person free falling without a safety net. James, from Willow Creek, didn't need to see the scene to know they were crumbling. He could feel it through the way the story spread and the whispers he overheard from an old police radio he kept in the garage, where other officers were starting to murmur about the Grayson-Pierce scandal. He knew the pressure was weighing heavily on them, and he knew they would soon make an even bigger mistake. All he had to do was wait. He walked into the house, grabbed a new bottle of whiskey from the kitchen cabinet, poured a glass, and raised it in front of Duke's picture. "This one's for you, Duke," he said, his voice deep and resolute. "They're scared, and I'm going to make them even more afraid." He took a sip, feeling the spicy warmth slide down his throat, and sat down in a chair, let his mind shift to the next step. The footage and the files had shaken them. But James wanted more. He wanted them to lose their jobs, lose their honor, lose everything they had ever relied on to hurt others. He opened his laptop once more, checked his anonymous email, and saw a new message from the reporter. The story is getting bigger. We have a source inside the precinct saying Grayson and Pierce are about to face an internal investigation. Stay in touch. James closed the laptop, stood up, and stepped out into the backyard again. He looked down at Duke's grave and a thought flashed in his mind. An internal investigation isn't enough. I need to push harder. He knew how to make Grayson and Pierce dig their own graves deeper, and when the time was right, he would deliver the final blow. The evening sunlight faded over the sky of Willow Creek, leaving the last orange streaks on the small rooftops. James Carter stood in the backyard of the house at 214 Oak Street, his hand resting on Duke's grave, feeling the cold earth beneath his palm. He had just returned from a brief trip to Raleigh, where it added another piece to his plan to ruin Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, a plan that would not only strip them of their reputations, but also push them down an irreversible path. He looked up at the horizon and whispered to Duke, "They have no way out. Duke, I'm tightening the noose around them." In the living room, the TV was still on, tuned to the local news channel. The sound was turned down low, but James could still catch the key phrases. Grayson and Pierce internal investigation, public pressure. The story he had set in motion had now spiraled far beyond control of the two cops. It had ignited into a wildfire sweeping across Raleigh, fueled by social media posts, interviews with former victims, and small protests that were starting to pop up outside the police station. But James knew the internal investigation wasn't moving fast enough, wasn't strong enough to deliver real justice. He needed to push them to the brink, to make them destroy themselves. He walked into the house, sat down at the oak table, and opened his laptop. On the screen was the latest email from a reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer. Sources inside the department say Grayson and Pierce are losing control. They're arguing with their boss and threatening colleagues. The investigation is ramping up, but they haven't been suspended yet. Anything else? James smirked. Their desperation was exactly what he had been waiting for. He quickly typed an anonymous message. "Don't worry. More is coming. Keep an eye on the news." He hit send, then closed the laptop, shifting his mind to the next step. James knew that Grayson and Pierce wouldn't just sit back and wait to be fired or prosecuted. They were too arrogant, too accustomed to using their power to escape consequences. He predicted they would try to find him, confront him head-on to regain some control, and he was ready for that. He stood up, walked to the garage, and double-checked his gear. A new mini camera, smaller and with a more sensitive microphone, along with another burner phone he had bought with cash at a convenience store 30 miles outside of Raleigh. He stuffed them into the pocket of his black hoodie, then pulled out the Raleigh map, marking a new location, a small park near the police station, where he had overheard that Pierce often smoked after work. He drove his old Toyota Corolla to Raleigh, parking about half a mile from the park, and walked through the dark alleys to avoid being spotted. When he arrived, he was behind a row of oak trees, watching from a distance. Pierce showed up right on cue around 6 p.m., stepping out from the back of the police station, cigarette in hand, moving heavily like a man who had just been cornered. James set up a mini camera on a low branch, adjusting the angle to clearly capture Pierce's face, and waited. Not long after, Grayson appeared, his face tense, eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept in days. They stood close together, speaking in low voices but filled with anger. James couldn't hear them clearly from this distance, but the camera's microphone would catch every word. He saw Pierce pointing at Grayson, shouting something, and then Grayson shoved him back, the two nearly ready to throw punches right in the middle of the park. James smiled. Their loss of control was exactly what he needed. He waited until they walked away. Grayson headed to his car, while Pierce tossed a cigarette to the ground and stomped on it. Then he lowered the camera to review the footage. The sound was clear. "You've gotten us into this mess, Tom," Pierce roared. "I told you to leave that guy alone, but you just had to play." Grayson shot back. "You're the one who shot the dog, Dan. Don't blame me." James drove back to Willow Creek, feeling relieved but not relaxed. He knew that the footage was gold, not just evidence of their wrongdoing, but a direct confession about Duke's death. the final piece to tighten the noose. He transferred the video to another USB drive, then mailed it anonymously to the Raleigh News and Observer from a post office in the suburbs, 25 miles away from his home. He wore a mask and a baseball cap, leaving no trace. Everything was calculated like a military operation. The next day, the news exploded once again. James sat in the living room, turned on the TV, and saw the faces of Grayson and Pierce flash across the screen, this time accompanied by audio from Park. The host said, "A new video shows officers Grayson and Pierce admitting their involvement in the shooting of a dog at Willow Creek, an incident that sparked the current scandal. The public is calling for immediate suspension, and authorities have stated that a criminal investigation may be underway soon." James stood up, stepped out the backyard, and knelt by Duke's grave. "Can you hear me, Duke?" he said, his voice low and steady. They've confessed. Now, there's no one left to save them. He felt a surge of power coursing through him, not joy, but the cold satisfaction of a soldier who had just completed a crucial mission. But he knew it wasn't over. Internal investigations and public pressure were one thing, but to truly destroy them from within, he needed to push them into complete despair. He turned back into the house, opened his laptop once more, and began writing another anonymous email, this time to a social activist group in Raleigh he had found online, the ones who had organized protests outside the police station. The message was brief. Grayson and Pierce will try to deny it. Don't let them get away. Here's a list of past victims. Find them. He attached a file from the complaint records and hit send. He knew these people would take action. They would reach out to the victims, stir the pot even more, and make sure Grayson and Pierce had nowhere left to hide. Meanwhile, at the Raleigh police station, Grayson and Pierce are falling apart. James doesn't need to be there to know what's happening. He can hear it over the police radio in the garage. Pierce has smashed a mirror in the break room, shouting at his colleagues that it's all a lie, while Grayson sits silently, his face pale, not saying a word. Their boss, an old colonel named Hargrove, has called him into his office, his voice booming over the radio. "You two have turned this station into a joke. I don't want to hear any excuses. I want you both out of here until the investigation is complete." James turned off the radio, stood up, and poured himself a fresh glass of whiskey. He raised a glass in front of Duke's picture and said, "They're falling apart, Duke, but I won't stop until they've lost everything." He took a sip, feeling the burn slide down his throat, and sat down, let his mind shift to the final blow of strike. He knew would leave Grayson and Pierce unable to rise again. The sun set over Willow Creek, leaving a sky as red as blood above the small rooftops of this suburban town. James Carter stood in the living room at 214 Oak Street, a glass of whiskey in hand, his deep brown eyes gazing out the window at the road that was quieter than ever. But that silence wasn't a sign of peace. It was a calm before the storm that would sweep everything away. He knew Grayson and Pierce were teetering on the edge, the footage, the complaint files, and public pressure tightening around them. But James wasn't satisfied. He wanted them to lose everything, not just their reputation or badge, but their very will to rise again. And tonight, he would deliver the final blow. He set the glass down on the oak table, where the two badges of Grayson and Pierce lay next to a faded photo of Duke, like trophies that had lost their shine. He walked over to the laptop, opened a new anonymous email, and began to type. This message wasn't going to a reporter or a social activist group. It was going straight to Colonel Hargrove, the commander of the Raleigh Police Department, who James knew was desperately trying to extinguish this scandal to save the department's reputation. The content was brief but sharp. Grayson and Pierce will try to run. Don't let them get away. This is the final evidence they confessed everything. He attached the footage from the park, where Pierce admitted to shooting Duke and Grayson confessed to being an accomplice, then sent it off through an untraceable encrypted server. James knew Hargrove would act not out of sense of justice, but because he needed a head to sacrifice to the outraged public. He stood up, walked out to the garage, and turned on the old police radio, tuning in to eavesdrop on the conversations at the station. Hargrove's voice boomed through the speaker, deep and furious. "Grayson, Pierce, get into my office right now. I just got a hold of the footage you two wrapped up." James smirked, turned off the radio, and headed back to the living room. He knew what was about to happen. Hargrove would suspend them immediately, and with that footage, a criminal investigation would be launched. but he wanted to make sure they couldn't escape their fate. Meanwhile, at the Raleigh police station, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas Grayson sat in Hargrove's office, his hands trembling as he cradled his head, his face pale as if he had just seen a ghost. Daniel Pierce leaned against a wall, his eyes bloodshot, his hands clenched into fists as if he wanted to smash something, but there was nothing left to hit. Hargrove stood behind his desk, his hands pressed against the surface, his voice hissing. "Do you two think I'm an idiot? This footage shows you admitting to shooting that dog, and Grayson is standing there agreeing. The public is demanding your heads, and I can't protect you anymore." Grayson looked up, his voice trembling. "Boss, we don't know who's behind this. Someone is targeting us. Maybe it's Carter, but we don't have any proof." Hargrove slammed his hand down on the table, causing the coffee cup to spill everywhere. "I don't care who's behind it. You two dug your own grave attacking someone in their own home, admitting it on tape. I'm suspending both of you, immediately turning your badges and guns. And get out of here before I call in the criminal investigation team." Pierce rushed in, shouting, "You can't do this. We're the police, we have the authority." But Hargrove didn't budge, his gaze as cold as ice. "Your authority ended the moment that footage aired. Get out now." Pierce was about to charge at Hargrove, but Grayson pulled him back, murmuring, "Don't, Dan, it's over for us." They left the office, heads bowed low, the sound of their heavy footsteps echoing like a funeral march. James didn't need to listen to the radio to know what was going on. He could feel it in the air. He turned on the TV, and the evening news came on. Breaking news: 2 Raleigh police officers, Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, have been suspended after new video was sent to the police station showing them admitting to their involvement in the death of a dog at Willow Creek. Authorities confirmed that a criminal investigation is underway. James turned off the TV, stood up, and walked out to the backyard, kneeling by Duke's grave. "They've lost their badges, Duke," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I want them to lose a lot more than that." He turned back into the house, opened his laptop once more, and checked his email from the social activism team. They had responded. "We've found 5 former victims who are ready to speak out. Thanks to the list. We'll be protesting in front of the station tomorrow." James nodded. The public pressure was no longer just a spark, but a raging wildfire that couldn't be extinguished. He knew Grayson and Pierce wouldn't be able to handle it. They would completely crumble, not just professionally, but emotionally as well. The next day, James drove to Raleigh, parking about a mile from the police station, and walked closer to the protest. Dozens of people had gathered at the gate, holding up signs that read, "Justice for the victims," and "Grayson and Pierce belong in jail." He stood in the shadows of a nearby alley, watching. Grayson and Pierce didn't show up, but James knew they were somewhere nearby, probably hiding in their homes, maybe trying to figure out a way to escape. But he had cut off all their escape routes. He came home, sat down in the armchair, and poured himself a fresh glass of whiskey. He raised a glass in front of Duke's picture and said, "They've lost everything, Duke, jobs, honor, power. But I'm not done yet. They won't just be suspended. They'll have to face the law." He took a sip, feeling the burn slide down his throat, and closed his eyes, allowing his mind to rest for the first time in days. He knew the criminal investigation would soon begin, and with the evidence he had unleashed, Grayson and Pierce wouldn't be able to escape prison. Meanwhile, in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of Raleigh, Grayson and Pierce sat across from each other, the air thick with the smell of beer and cigarettes. Grayson stared out the window, his voice hoarse. "We're done, Dan. There's no turning back." Pierce slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "It's Carter? I know it is. I'll find him." But he stopped, realizing the futility of his words. They had no power left, no badge, nothing but despair. James, from Willow Creek, didn't need to see that scene to know they had fallen. He stood up, stepped out into the backyard once more, and looked up at the night sky. He knew this victory was his, not just for Duke, but for all those who had ever been hurt by them. But he was still waiting for true justice to arrive when they faced court, and James would be there to witness it. The night sky over Willow Creek gradually faded as the first rays of dawn broke, casting a golden hue on the old oak trees surrounding the house at 214 Oak Street. James Carter stood in the backyard, his hand resting on Duke's grave, feeling the cold earth beneath his palm now radiating a peace he hadn't felt since that fateful night. He had just returned from Raleigh, where he had watched from a distance as the protests outside the police station dwindled, leaving behind a heavy yet hopeful atmosphere. Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce had been suspended, their reputations shattered, and a criminal investigation loomed over them like a blade ready to drop. But for James, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of true justice. He stepped into the house, the old army boots creaking softly on the wooden floor. The living room was now silent, no longer filled with the TV blaring hot news, nor the police radio shrieking with arguments from the Raleigh station. On the oak table, 2 badges from Grayson and Pierce lay next to a photo of Duke trophies of victory he had snatched from the shadows. He sank into the armchair, poured a glass of whiskey from the nearly empty Jack Daniels bottle, and lifted the glass in front of the photo. "They've lost everything, Duke," he said, his voice deep and resolute. "Their jobs, their honor, their power I've taken all from them. But I won't stop until they're behind bars." He took a sip, the burn sliding down his throat like a declaration that he was still alive, still fighting. James set his glass down, stood up, and walked over to the window. He looked out at Willow Creek Road, where the neighbors were now passing by with a mix of curiosity and relief. They didn't know who he was, didn't know what he had done, but they could sense the change. He knew the story of Grayson and Pierce didn't just end in Raleigh. It spread throughout North Carolina, becoming a warning to other abusers of power. And deep down, a small part of him felt satisfied not out of joy, but because he had kept his promise to Duke. He turned back to the table, holding the picture of Duke in his hands, his fingers gently brushing over the dog's deep brown eyes. He recalled the days they spent together in that backyard, Duke bounding across the grass, ears perked up, eyes shining like a friend who would never leave. "You protected me, Duke," he whispered, his voice now softer, carrying a hint of lingering pain. "And I protected you in my own way." He set the picture down, and for the first time in many days, he felt a true stillness, not emptiness, but the peace of a soldier who knows he has completed a phase of the battle. James stepped into the garage, opened a metal chest from the Delta Force era, and checked what was left inside. A dagger, some paracord, and a tactical notebook. He didn't need them anymore, at least not for now. The war in the shadows was over, but he knew a battle under the light was coming, where Grayson and Pierce would face the court, where he would stand up as a witness, where justice would finally be served. He closed the chest, locking it tight with the code 623, and stood up, allowing his mind to rest for the first time since the gunfire echoed on the streets of Willow Creek. Meanwhile, in Raleigh, Grayson and Pierce had completely fallen apart. James didn't need to be there to see it. He knew from the evening news he watched before turning off the TV. Grayson had locked himself away in his rundown apartment. The door bolted tight, the curtains drawn shut, like a wounded animal waiting to die. Pierce, on the other hand, had gone to a dive bar, drinking himself into a stupor and shouting to anyone who would listen that it's all a lie. But no one believed him anymore. They were no longer cops. They were outcasts, shadows of their former selves, and James knew that was more painful than any punch he had ever thrown. He stepped out into the backyard once more, standing by Duke's grave as the dawn light flooded the space. A gentle breeze blew through, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the stillness of a new day. He knelt down, placing his hand on the soil, and said, "I did it, Duke. They lost everything, but I'll make sure they never forget you." He stood up, looking up at the now bright sky, feeling a surge of strength coursing through him, not anger, not pain, but the resolve of a man who has found his purpose. James stepped into the house, sank into the armchair one last time, and closed his eyes. He wasn't sleeping. He didn't need to sleep right now. He just let his mind settle, allowing his breath to blend with the stillness of the home that had once been his refuge with Duke. He knew the battle wasn't over. Grayson and Pierce would face the law, and he would be there, not as a ghost in the shadows, but as a witness in the light. But for now, he could rest, even if just for a moment, because he had torn them apart from the inside, just as he had promised. He opened his eyes, looked at the picture of Duke once more, and smiled a small smile, not one of joy, but of cold satisfaction. "Rest easy, Duke," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I'll take care of the rest." He stood up, walked the front door, and gazed out at the world waking up. The daylight streamed to the window of the small house at 214 Oak Street, Willow Creek, North Carolina, casting a glow on the rugged face of James Carter as he stood before the mirror in his bedroom. He wore a simple black suit, not the flashy kind that lawyers typically flaunt, but one he picked up from a budget store in Raleigh, formal enough to step into the courtroom, yet still bearing the look of a soldier who had fought in the shadows. He adjusted his tie, his hand steady, but his deep brown eyes sparkled with a rare tension. Today wasn't the day he would beat Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce in dark alleys, nor was the day he would release footage to ruin their reputations. Today was the day he would face them in the light in the courtroom, where justice would finally be served. James stepped into the living room, where Grayson and Pierce's police badges still lay on the oak table next to a picture of Duke. He picked up the photo, his fingers gently brushing over the deep brown eyes of the dog, and whispered, "Today is for you, Duke. I'm going to end this." He set the picture down, took a deep breath, and felt a surge of strength flow through him, not anger, not pain, but the resolve of a man who had come too far to turn back. He drove his old Ford F-150 to the Wake County Courthouse in downtown Raleigh, about 20 miles from Willow Creek. The road was busier than usual this morning, cars jostling for space, with a few media vehicles parked near the courthouse sporting the logos of the Raleigh News and Observer and local news channels. James parked a few blocks away, walking to the crowd gathered outside the courthouse, holding up signs that read, "Justice for Willow Creek, and Grayson and Pierce must pay." He didn't stop, didn't look at them. He kept his head down, walking into the courthouse with the steady gait of a soldier preparing for battle. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and the hushed whispers of those present. James walked into courtroom number 3, where the trial of Grayson and Pierce was about to begin. He took a seat in the back row, near the exit, his gaze sweeping across the room. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman named Ellen Hayes with stern expression, was organizing papers on the table. The defense attorney, a short man in an expensive suit, was whispering to Grayson and Pierce at the defendant's table. Grayson sat still, his shoulders hunched, his face pale as if he had lost the pride he once had. Pierce, on the other hand, was different. He was grinding his teeth, gripping the edge of the table tightly, his eyes bloodshot like a cornered beast. James said nothing, remained still. He waited, calming his mind, letting the memories of Duke the gunfire, the blood staining the pavement, the dog's final gaze rise up like a smoldering flame, not to burn him but to remind him why he was here. The judge, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, entered and banged his gavel to open the court session. The Wake County Court is now in session for the case of the state versus Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, he announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The defendants are charged with abuse of power, assault, and other offenses. Prosecutor, you may begin. Ellen Hayes stood up, her voice clear and sharp as a knife. Your Honor, today we will prove that Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce not only abused their police power to assault an innocent citizen, but also deliberately covered up their misconduct for years. We will present evidence, including video footage, testimonies, and records that show they are a danger to the community. She paused, her gaze sweeping over Grayson and Pierce before turning to James. We would like to call our first witness, Mr. James Carter. James stood up, walked slowly but steadily to the witness stand. He placed his hand on the Bible, took an oath, and sat down, facing a room that had fallen silent enough to hear everyone's breathing. Ellen Hayes stepped forward, her gaze meeting his for a brief moment, as if she understood what he had been through. Mr. Carter, she began, please tell us your full name and your occupation. James Carter, he replied, his voice deep and steady. I work in private security. I used to be a soldier in the U.S. Army Delta Force. A soft murmur rippled through the room. The reputation of Delta Force was not something one would expect from a quiet man like him. Ellen nodded. Can you recount the events that took place on the evening of March 4th at Willow Creek? James took a deep breath, letting the memories rise up, not to weaken him, but to make him stronger. I was walking my dog, he began, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of pain. His name is Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd that I've trained since he was a pup. He's my buddy, my family. We were on a small path near home when Grayson and Pierce showed up in the patrol car. He stopped, his gaze flickering between Grayson and Pierce. Grayson hung his head, while Pierce glared back at him with hostility. They stopped me, asked where I lived, demanded to see my papers. I cooperated, handed over my ID, told them I lived at 214 Oak Street. But they didn't believe me. They said I looked suspicious, that I didn't belong there. They started pushing me, threatening me. And when Duke growled to protect me, Pierce, his voice faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Pierce pulled his gun and shot him, one shot right in the chest. Duke fell right in front of me. The courtroom fell silent, with only the heavy breathing of a few people in the crowd breaking the stillness. Ellen stepped closer. "And then what, Mr. Carter?" James gritted his teeth, but his voice remained steady. I screamed, trying to run to Duke, but they handcuffed me, beat me, and shoved me into a car. They didn't arrest me. They held me for a few hours and then let me go, as if it was just a normal thing. Ellen nodded and turned to the judge. "We have footage from that night, along with testimony from other witnesses, which will be presented later. But Mr. Carter, can you tell us why you're here today?" James looked straight into her eyes, then turned to Grayson and Pierce. "I'm here because they're criminals," he said, his voice now sharp as steel. "They killed Duke, they hurt me, and many others too. I'm here to make sure they don't do it to anyone else." Grayson hunched his shoulders deeper. Pierce slammed his fist on the table, but the defense attorney pulled him back. Ellen offered a faint smile. "No more questions, Your Honor." James sat still, his gaze fixed on Grayson and Pierce, knowing that his testimony had just marked the beginning of their end. Courtroom number 3 at the Wake County Courthouse in Raleigh was enveloped in a heavy silence after James Carter's testimony. He sat on the witness stand, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, his deep brown eyes fixed on Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, two men who now seemed like mere shadows of their former selves. Grayson hung his head, shoulders slumped like a man who had given up all hope, while Pierce clenched his jaw, his bloodshot eyes glaring at James as if he wanted to incinerate him on the spot. But James stood firm. He had faced far more dangerous foes than them on moonless nights in the battlefield, and today he knew he held the power. Prosecutor Ellen Hayes stepped up to the evidence display table, picked up a small USB drive, and held it high for everyone in the room to see. "Your Honor," she said, her voice resonant and sharp, "we would like to present the footage from the night of March 4th at Willow Creek, along with a second video capturing the defendant's confession about their actions." The judge nodded, and a court clerk turned on the projector. The large screen behind the witness stand lit up, and the images from James's mini camera came into focus, showing Grayson and Pierce cornering him on the sidewalk, pushing him, handcuffing him, and then the sound of gunfire erupted as Pierce shot Duke. Whispers filled the room as a few people covered their mouths. Some shook their heads, and a woman in the audience broke down in tears. James stared straight at the screen, feeling each stab of memory pierce his heart, but he kept his face as cold as ice. He saw Duke fall again, watched blood spreading on the pavement, and heard his own scream echo through the speakers. The footage ended with Grayson sneering as he shoved him into the patrol car, and then the screen shifted to the second clip in the park near the Raleigh station, where Pierce shouted, "You're the one who shot the dog, Dan," and Grayson shot back, "You got us into this mess." The courtroom erupted in whispers, but the judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Ellen turned to James. "Mr. Carter, do you recognize the defendants in this footage?" James nodded, his voice deep and steady. "Yes, that's Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, the two who killed Duke and attacked me." Ellen nodded and turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense attorney, a short man named Richard Klein, stood up, adjusting his tie with a facade of confidence. He stepped closer to James, wearing a faint smile. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "you say you're a former Delta Force, right? A man trained to fight, to kill. Do you expect us to believe you're just an innocent victim in all of this?" James looked Klein straight in the eye, unwavering. "I was trained to protect, not to attack the innocent," he replied, his voice as cold as steel. "I did nothing to provoke them that night. They chose to act that way." Klein smirked and continued, "So why didn't you fight back? A guy like you could definitely take them down right there, right?" James clenched his jaw, but his voice remained steady. "Because I knew that fighting back would give them an excuse to kill me just like they killed Duke." I wouldn't give them that excuse. Klein scoffed and turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. But James knew he had won. The judge's gaze, the public's attention, all leaned in his direction. Ellen stood up once more, calling another witness, a black man named Marcus Tate, a former victim of Grayson and Pierce, who had been beaten by them 3 years ago. Tate recounted his story with a trembling yet determined voice, and behind him were 3 others, all confirming the violent behavior pattern of the 2 defendants. Each testimony was like a hammer blow to Grayson and Pierce, and James watched as they slowly crumbled. Grayson held his head in his hands. Pierce slammed his fist on the table, but no one was listening to them anymore. When the court session took a break, James stepped out into the hallway, breathing in the cold air of the courthouse. He stood there, gazing out the window at the crowd still gathered outside, feeling a surge of power coursing through him, not joy, but a chilling satisfaction. He knew that Grayson and Pierce had no way out. The evidence was too clear, the testimonies too strong, and the public too outraged for them to turn the tide. The trial continued in the afternoon, and after Ellen delivered her closing argument, a sharp speech about justice, accountability, and abuse of power, it was Klein's turn. He stood up, his voice trembling, tried to argue that Grayson and Pierce were merely doing their duty and that the footage had been taken out of context. But his words were weak, unconvincing, and as he sat down, James noticed the judge's gaze that all the verdict had already been decided. The judge banged the gavel, calling for silence, and stood up to read the verdict. Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce, he began, his voice booming like thunder. Based on the undeniable evidence from the footage, testimonies, and records, along with the confessions of the defendants themselves, the court finds you both guilty of the charges of abuse of power, assault, and serious misconduct in the line of duty. You have exploited your authority to harm innocent people, and such actions are intolerable. The courtroom held its breath as he continued. I hereby sentence Thomas Grayson to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Daniel Pierce, for the direct act of shooting Mr. Carter's dog and assaulting him, is also sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and boos. Grayson collapsed onto the table while Pierce shouted, "This is a lie!" But 2 court officers pulled him away, handcuffing him one last time. James sat still, feeling his heart pound not out of joy, but from a sense of completeness. He watched as Grayson and Pierce were let out of the room, their eyes now empty, stripped of any pride. He stood up, walked out of the courthouse, and felt the afternoon sun warm his face. He had done it, justice had been served, unwavering, just as he had promised Duke. The sunset settled over Willow Creek, casting a golden hue on the old oak trees surrounding the house at 214 Oak Street. James Carter drove his old Ford F-150 back from the Wake County Courthouse in Raleigh, where he had just witnessed Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce being sentenced to 25 years in prison, harsh, unforgiving sentence he had fought hard to achieve. The road home felt quieter than ever, with only the soft rumble of the engine and the whisper of the wind slipping to the cracked window. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need the noise. He wanted to savor the silence, the stillness he had reclaimed from the shadows. When he got home, James stepped into the backyard, his old army boots sinking into the soft grass. He knelt by Duke's grave, placing his hand on the cold earth, and felt a wave of peace wash over him, not joy, but the completeness of a promise fulfilled. "I did it, Duke," he said, his voice low and warm. "They paid the price for 25 years. No way out. You can rest now." A gentle breeze blew through, carrying the scent of fresh grass, as if Duke was responding to him from somewhere far away. James stood up, walked into the house, and sat down in the armchair in the living room. On the oak table, the 2 badges of Grayson and Pierce still lay there, but now they were no longer trophies. They were remnants of a battle that had come to an end. He picked up the picture of Duke, gazing into the deep brown eyes of the dog, and smiled a small smile, not one of victory, but of peace. "Thank you, Duke," he whispered. "You gave me a reason to carry on." He set the picture down, and for the first time since that fateful night, he felt a sense of relief. No more anger, no more pain, just the quiet of a soldier who had completed his mission. He poured a glass of whiskey from the nearly empty Jack Daniels bottle, raised it in front of the photo, and took one last sip. He stood up, walked out the front door, and looked up at the night sky, now bright with stars. Grayson and Pierce were locked behind bars, but for James, the real victory wasn't the sentence. It was the way he had brought justice for Duke, for himself, and for all those they had hurt. He turned back, closed the door, and let the house sink into peaceful darkness, knowing that tomorrow would be a new day without any ghosts haunting him anymore. The morning light poured through the old oak trees at Willow Creek, casting a gentle golden hue over the narrow path leading to 214 Oak Street, like a welcoming carpet for James Carter's return. He drove his old Ford F-150 from Raleigh after the trial at the Wake County Courthouse, where he had witnessed Thomas Grayson and Daniel Pierce being sentenced to 25 years in prison, without parole, a harsh but fair sentence for the crimes they committed against Duke and other innocent lives. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Fingers calloused from years of holding a gun now clenched not out of stress, but from a sense of wholeness he never thought he would find again after that fateful night. The 20-mile stretch from Raleigh to Willow Creek felt longer today, not because of the physical distance, but because his mind drifted back to days gone by, the days when Duke walked beside him, and the nights he fought in the darkness to reclaim justice for his loyal dog. The car rolled into the driveway. James turned off the engine and stepped out cabin. He stood still in the cool morning air, letting the breeze tousle his dark hair, now streaked with a few silver strands, carrying the scent of fresh grass and damp earth he used to inhale every day while walking Duke. He gazed at his small white house, the low fence now covered with thin layer of moss, wild daisies sprouting amidst the unkempt lawn, and the garage door still ajar from a night he had set a trap for Grayson and Pierce to catch their wrongdoing. Everything looked the same, but for James, it was different. No longer a battlefield filled with schemes and blood, but a sanctuary, a place for him to close a long, painful chapter filled with determination. He stepped into the house, the old military boots softly creaking on the worn oak floor that had faded over the years. The living room was unusually quiet now, no longer filled with the TV blaring hot news about the Grayson and Pierce scandal, nor the police radio screeching with arguments from the Raleigh precinct. A faint light from the window fell on the oak table, where the two police badges of Grayson and Pierce lay silently beside a photo of Duke, evidence of a battle that had ended, now just remnants of their failure. James picked up the photo, his thumb gently brushing over the deep brown eyes of the dog, where he had once seen loyalty and fierce spirit. A faint smile flickered across his lips, not a smile of joy, but one of cold satisfaction. "You see this, Duke," he whispered, his voice low and warm, carrying a hint of the days when they were together. "They paid the price for 25 years. No way out. I did right by you." He set the photo down, walked over to the kitchen cabinet, and took out the last bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey in the house, a bottle he had saved since the early days of the war, reserved for this moment. He poured a full glass, neat, no ice, the amber liquid shimmering under the dim morning light. He raised the glass in front of Duke's picture, gazing into the dog's eyes as if it were still here, still waiting for him to come home after a long day. "This is for you, Duke," he said, his voice now carrying a warm resolve, like a final vow. He took a long sip, feeling the spicy burn slide down his throat, igniting his chest like a small flame not to consume him, but to remind him that he was still alive, still standing strong after everything that had happened. He set the glass down on the table, and for the first time in many months, he felt a void in his heart filled not with joy or triumph, but with the peace of a man who had fulfilled his promise to his most loyal friend. James stepped out into the backyard, where Duke's grave lay quietly beneath the shade of a large oak tree, a small patch of earth that he had dug with his own hands on that painful night. He knelt down, placing his hand on the now hardened soil, feeling the cold seep through his palm, and letting memories flood back like a slow but unstoppable river. He remembered the day he brought Duke home from the training camp at Fort Bragg, a lively 8-month-old puppy with glossy black fur streaked with reddish brown, ears standing tall like radar, and bright, vibrant eyes full of life. He recalled the mornings they would jog together along the winding path of Willow Creek, the sound of Duke's paws rhythmically tapping on the pavement harmonizing with his own breath, like an unspoken melody of companionship. He remembered the nights he returned from missions in the Middle East, his body scarred and his soul shattered, with Duke lying beside him on the wooden floor, silent yet enough to soothe the nightmares that no words could heal. "Duke," he said, his voice now softer, carrying a hint of nostalgia and tenderness that he rarely revealed. You were the best friend I ever had, loyal, strong, never leaving my side no matter what. You protected me, even when I didn't deserve it, and I protected you in my own way. He bowed his head, letting the wind tousle his hair, now streaked with few gray strands, carrying the scent of damp earth and memories of the days they shared. He didn't cry. His tears had run dry the night he buried Duke beneath this very soil. But in his heart, a part of the dog lived on, like a small flame that never extinguished, a light guiding him through his darkest days. James stood up, walked into the garage, and opened the metal chest from the Delta Force days one last time today. He took out the tactical notebook, flipping through the yellowed pages where he had written his plans for revenge against Grayson and Pierce, sharp notes about the alleys in Raleigh, O'Malley's Bar, and the Rusty Anchor, the nights he set up mini cameras to capture their crimes. He placed the notebook down on the desk, picked up an old pencil, and wrote the final line in bold script. March 10th, 2025 justice has been served. Rest in peace, Duke. He closed the notebook, tucked it back into the chest along with the dagger and paracord, then locked it tight with the code 623 the day he received Duke, marking the end of a long journey filled with blood, sweat, and tears. He returned to the backyard, carrying a small piece of wood he had prepared the day before a simple headstone he had carved with a dagger during the rare breaks between court sessions. The inscription read, Duke, a loyal friend, 2019 to 2025. He planted the wood into the ground before the grave, standing still as he gazed at it in the soft morning light. The wind whispered through, gently shaking the headstone, and James felt profound stillness enveloping him, not emptiness, but the peace of someone who had reached the end of their journey. The midday light poured through the old oak trees at Willow Creek, casting a brilliant golden hue over Duke's grave, highlighting the small wooden marker that James Carter had placed there that morning. He stood there, hands stuffed in the pockets of his worn jacket, his deep brown eyes fixed on the inscription, Duke, a loyal friend, 2019 to 2025, as if the words that speak to him could somehow bring Duke back, even for just a moment. A gentle breeze swept through the backyard of the house at 214 Oak Street, carrying the rustling sound of dry leaves. But for James, this silence was no longer peaceful. It was profound emptiness, a loneliness he had never been prepared to face. He turned back into the house, walking slowly like a soldier just emerging from the battlefield. With no enemies left to fight, no targets to pursue, the living room was now oppressively silent, devoid of the TV blaring news about Grayson and Pierce, the police radio shrieking arguments from the Raleigh station, and most importantly, the sound of Duke's claws tapping on the wooden floor every time he opened the door. James sank into the armchair, his hands resting on his thighs, allowing the silence to envelop him. He stared at the two badges of Grayson and Pierce on the oak table, next to a pictured Duke, and for the first time since embarking on a quest for revenge, he wondered, what now? He had defeated Grayson, and Pierce was sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. Their reputations had turned to dust, and justice for Duke had been served. But that victory didn't bring the joy he had imagined during those nights spent planning in the garage, holding a mini camcorder and a tactical notebook. It didn't fill the void that Duke had left behind, didn't erase the image of blood staining the pavement, didn't soothe the pain of him kneeling beside his dog, screaming in helplessness. James closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the memories flood back, not to weaken him, but to remind him that Duke was not just a dog. He was a part of him, a part that he would never get back. He recalled an afternoon 2 years ago when he and Duke were sitting on the grass in the backyard. James had just returned from a private security contract in Iraq, his body weary and his soul heavy with the things he had witnessed: the explosions, the lifeless faces, the orders he couldn't refuse. He sat there, a bottle of whiskey in hand, staring out at the empty yard, while Duke lay beside him, his head resting on James's lap, his deep brown eyes looking up as if to say, I'm here. No words were spoken, but Duke's presence was enough to pull him out of the darkness, enough to remind him that he still had a reason to come home. Now, as he opens his eyes, the backyard is still there, but Duke is not. James gets up, walks over to the kitchen cabinet, and pulls out a small wooden box he had tucked away long ago, the box that held Duke's collar, an old, worn brown leather strap with metal tag engraved with its name. He opens the box, holds a collar in his hand, feeling its weight, and a wave of emotion rises in his chest, not anger, not sadness, but a deep, aching nostalgia that is also warm. He gently brushes his fingers over the tag, his touch gliding over the faded letters spelling Duke, and whispers, "You're always with me, right? No matter what I do, you never left my side." He brought the necklace out to the backyard, knelt by the grave, and placed it on the wooden headstone. "I'm not good at saying goodbye," he said, his voice now trembling slightly, not out of weakness, but because of the rare sincerity he was showing. "But I want you to know that everything I've done, the sleepless nights, the punches, the footage has all been for you. You deserve it, Duke. You deserve more than I do." He bowed his head, letting the wind blow through, carrying the scent of earth and memories of the days they once had. And for the first time since the night he buried Duke, he felt his eyes sting not with tears spilling over, but with a burning sensation, as if all the pain and love he had for Duke were trying to find a way out. James stood up, walked back into the house, and sat down in the armchair. He poured another glass of whiskey from the Jack Daniels bottle, raised it in front of the picture of Duke, and took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread like a silent tribute. He looked around the house at the bare walls, the worn-out armchair, and the backyard that now existed only in memory. He had fought, he had won. But that victory came at a cost. The loneliness of a man with no purpose to pursue, no friend to share with. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the now quiet Willow Creek Road bathed in the midday sun. He thought about Grayson and Pierce, two guys now locked away in their tiny 6-foot square rooms, stripped of their badges, their power, left with nothing but their failures. He thought about their other victims, those who could now hold their heads high thanks to the justice he had brought. But above all, he thought about Duke, the dog who had given him the strength to overcome it all, and now left with a void that nothing could fill. James returned, stepped into the garage, and opened the metal chest from the Delta Force days. He pulled out another photo, not the one on the desk, but one he took with Duke during a training session at Fort Bragg, where he stood tall, holding the leash, and Duke sat beside him, ears perked up, eyes sharp as a warrior. He placed the photo on the desk, gazed at it, and felt a wave of emotion rise up, not sadness, but pride. "You're a true warrior, Duke," he said, his voice now stronger, carrying a deep respect. "I'm just the one following in your footsteps." He turned back to the backyard, standing by the grave once more, and looked up at the sky, now bright and clear. He knew his journey with Duke had come to an end, but the memories of his dog would live on within him, not as a burden, but as a small flame, a guiding light through the days ahead. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh air, and whispered, "I won't forget you, Duke. Never." The wind blew gently, carrying a sense of peace, as if Duke was responding to him from somewhere far away. The afternoon sunlight faded over the sky of Willow Creek, leaving streaks of orange stretching across the backyard of the house at 214 Oak Street. James Carter stood by Duke's grave, his hand gently resting on the wooden headstone, engraved with the words, "Duke, a loyal friend, 2019 to 2025. His deep brown eyes staring into the void as if searching for a sign from his departed friend. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it a whisper of silence that he now embraced as part of himself. He had just endured a long day returning from the trial, memories of Duke flooding back, mingling with profound loneliness in the face of an incomplete victory. But now, in this moment, he felt a new light, not bright, not intense, but soft like the dawn. James bent down, gently stroking the headstone one last time, and whispered, "Rest easy, Duke. You did great. Now it's my turn to carry on." He stood up, took a deep breath of the fresh North Carolina air, and headed back inside. The living room no longer felt heavy. The two badges of Grayson and Pierce still lay on the oak table, but they were no longer a burden, just remnants of a closed chapter. He picked up the picture of Duke and placed it on a higher shelf, where the sunlight from the window could shine on it every day, a reminder that the dog was not just a memory, but a permanent part of him. He stepped up to the front door, opened it, and stood there, gazing at the now peaceful Willow Creek Road bathed in the glow of the setting sun. He thought about everything that had happened, the gunfire, the blood on the sidewalk, those nights he hid in the shadows to take down Grayson and Pierce, and the trial where justice was served. He reflected on the loneliness he had just faced, but now, It didn't feel so frightening anymore. Duke had given him the strength to fight, and that bittersweet victory was a testament to their loyalty to one another. James closed his eyes, letting the wind brush over his weathered face, and smiled a small smile, not one of great joy, but of acceptance. "I'll keep living, Duke," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Not for me, but for you." He turned back into the house, shut the door, and let the home sink into peaceful darkness. Outside, the fading light of day dimmed, but inside James, a small flame still burned the flame of memory, of loyalty, and a new life beginning from this quiet moment. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of James Carter and Duke, a story about loyalty, resilience, and unwavering justice. From the pain of loss to triumph in the darkness, James has shown us the power of friendship that overcomes all challenges. If you felt moved by that fire, please hit like and subscribe to our channel, so you won't miss out on other inspiring stories. We truly cherish every moment you spend here, sharing tears, laughter, and believing in what's right. Goodbye to you, the strong hearts who have walked this path with James. We'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon.